right, students, we're going to continue on in chapter 10 today. We're going to look at section 10.5, but I want to do a quick review from yesterday's lesson. If you notice, it says draw the graph of each open sentence and write the solution set. Circle whether it's a conjunction or a disjunction. Well, I made it kind of easy for you. Everything's already written out here. Again, for this one, we're going to have x is greater than or equal to -4, and x is less than 4. How did I know that was an and? Because they used the shortcut way, so we would circle conjunction. And then to graph it, you know, Mrs. Burton, I'm going to put 0 smack dab in the middle. I'm going to put 4 and an open dot, -4 and an open dot, and then there's my line segment. Over here, if you look at the second one, notice it says or, so this one has to be a This one has to be a disjunction. And again, to graph it, I'm going to put 0 in the middle, -2 with a closed dot going to the left, and +4 with an open dot going to the right. So just remember how to distinguish whether you have a conjunction or a disjunction. But today we're going to spend most of our time looking at this idea of absolute value. Do you remember what absolute value is? That's right, it's the distance from 0. The distance in number is from 0. So if you remember, when we did these back in chapter 1, I would say, what is the absolute value of 4? And everybody would say 4. And then I would say, what is the absolute value of -4? And everybody would say 4, because there's two numbers 4 spaces away from 0, one to the right and one to the left. So we're going to see one important aspect to remember when we're solving absolute value problems. Okay, there's going to always be two answers. Okay, we're going to always have two answers when we solve absolute value problems. Now, for a real quick little review, if I have the absolute value of x equals 2, well, remember, that means I've got two answers, okay, one to the right of 0 and one to the left of 0. And if I were going to graph that on a number line, we'll just put 0 in the middle, and we're going to put 2 to the right. And remember, we just use a big fat juicy dot and -2 to the left. Okay, so to graph when it's an equal to, when we've got an equation to graph them, we just got dots. Now, if I have the absolute value is less than 2, well, we've got one to the left and one to the right. And when I look at that, that looks like an and. That looks like a conjunction. So how do I graph a conjunction? Well, I go ahead and put my 0 in the middle. We've got -2 to the left, +2 to the right. And remember, it's going to be a line segment. We're going to connect the dots. If I was going to graph absolute value of x is greater than 2, well, it would look like this. We need an answer to the right. Okay, but we also need an answer to the left. And if I could take it to the left, then that means that we're going to have to be on the negative side. And if I go to graph that then, we're going to have my number line with 0 in the middle. And then if it's greater than 2, we're going to have an open dot going this way. And then on the left, it's at -2 with an open dot going this way. Now, those graphs should look really familiar as we look at those. So we're going to see that I can generalize the rules for writing solutions with absolute values to these. Again, if you look at the first one, okay, if we look at the first one, it's an equation. So I solve it once for the positive answer and once for the negative answer. If it says less than, we've got to remember to make that look like a conjunction. Now remember, conjunctions are ands, but it usually doesn't say and. We write it as the shorthand method. So if you notice, I take whatever A is, and I make it negative and flip it out in front, and then we've got less than x is less than A. Now, I have a clue word to help you remember, and the clue word I have is land. if you realize it's absolute value problems, I have to have two answers. If it is less than, we're going to treat it like an and. Now, the last scenario down here is if absolute value of x is greater than a. If it's absolute value and it's greater than, we've got to make it have two answers. So again, we've got to make a compound inequality, and if it's a greater than, we're going to treat it like an or. Okay, we're going to treat it like an or. So we answer it once for the positive answer, write it down, flip the sign, make it negative. So if it's greater than, we've got to make it look like a disjunction. Now, the word I have for you is gore. I don't remember if it was Halloween when I taught this or what, but the word is gore. If it's greater than, we've got to make it look like an or. So now we only worry about using those clue words, land and gore, when we have absolute value problems. So let's try one of each and see what happens. So if we look at my first equation here, you've got to notice number one, oh, this is absolute value, so I need two answers, but this one is an equation. So we've got to realize, hey, I've got to write it twice. I've got to solve it once for the positive answer, and then I've got to solve it again for the negative answer. So we're going to subtract 7 from both sides. So we've got k equals negative 4 here. And then on the second equation, when I subtract 7, we've got k equals negative 10. So there's my two answers. And then we're just going to plot them on our graph. Now remember, I'm going to put 0 in there somewhere. Negative 4 is to the left of 0. And then negative 10 is a little further down. So if it's absolute value equation, we write it once, solve it once for the positive answer, once for the negative answer, isolate k, and then we've got our graph is going to be big fat juicy dots on a number line. Now, let's see what happens on scenario number 2. If you look at number 2, we've got less than. Well, remember, we said if it's less than, we're going to treat it like an and. Our clue word was land. Now, how are we going to take this and make it look like an and? Well, we're going to take the answer and make it negative and flip it out in front. Is less than t plus 4 is less than 10. So we've got to take that equation and rewrite it to look like this to get our two answers. Now, we're going to go back to what we did last night for homework. We've got to get t alone. So we're going to subtract 4, but whatever we do in the middle, we do the front and back. So we've got negative 14 is less than t is less than 6. So t is greater than negative 14, and t is less than 6. So I'm going to put 0 here. I'm going to go to the right and put a 6 with an open dot. I'm going to go to the left and put negative 14 with an open dot. And they're going to overlap in that line segment between the two. Very nicely done. Okay, now let's look over here at number 3. How are we going to decide which compound inequality is this? It's absolute value. So I've got to have a compound inequality since it's greater than. Since it's greater than, our key word was or. We've got to make this look like an or. Now, to me, this is the hardest one to remember what to do. We're going to write down the first time exactly what's written. You notice and then we're going to say or. We put what's in the brackets again, flip the sign, make it negative. If you remember last night when we were doing all those disjunctions, my inequality signs were going in opposite directions, so I would have rays going in opposite directions, or we could make our airplane. Well, now that I have two different equations, now I'm just going to solve. I've got to get rid of the 4, get rid of my floater. So we've got negative v is greater than equal to 1. Oh, did you notice we have a negative 1 in front of our v? So we're going to have to divide everything by negative 1, which means we're going to have to flip the sign. Remember to flip. Let's see what happens on the second equation here. Once again, we're going to subtract 4 Negative b is less than or equal to negative 9. Oh, once again, we've got that negative sign in front of our variable, so we're going to have to flip the sign again. We get positive 9. To graph it, I'm going to put 0 in there somewhere. I'm going to put negative 1 to the left with a closed dot and my arrow going to the left. Down here to 9, closed dot, greater than 9, arrow going to the right. So again, absolute value, I have to have two answers. If it's an absolute value inequality, what determines which compound inequality I have is the inequality sign. If it's less than, we've got to make it look like an and. If it's greater than, we've got to make it look like an or. Now let's look here. If you notice, I added some things. I don't just have an inequality, an absolute value inequality. I've got some extra things. Now I like to call that fluff. So what we're going to see that we're going to have to do, if I have something more than my brackets and an answer, I need to get the brackets alone first. So to do that, if I'm looking at number 4, the first thing I need to do is I need to add 1 to both sides. So we've got 4 times the absolute value of p is less than or equal to 16. If you notice, I still need to get rid of that 4 in front of my absolute value brackets. So now I have the absolute value of p is less than or equal to 4. We had to divide everything by 4. Now that I have my absolute value bracket alone, now I can make it look like a compound inequality. Because it's less than, we're going to make it look like an and. And then we graph it. 0 in the middle. Negative 4. Did you notice we're going to have closed dots this time? And then we need our overlap, our line that connects them, the line segment. Okay, now let's look at number 5. When I look at number 5, once again, I've got extra things. I call that fluff. We've got to get rid of the fluff first to get absolute value bracket alone. So we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. So I have negative 3. I've still got y in the absolute value bracket, less than negative 3. Now we've got to get rid of that negative 3 out in front. So we're going to divide both sides by negative 3. Oh, did you hear me say I divided by negative 3? So that means I've got to flip the sign and make it equal 1. And so now that I've got the bracket alone, I can make it look like an or because it's greater than. So y is less than 1, or y is flip the sign, make it negative. And again, to graph it, we got open dots this time. And again, my conjunction looks like a bus like it's supposed to, and my disjunction looks like a plane like it's supposed to. All right, so absolute value, 2 answers. And remember, the key to getting through these is remembering the generalization of our rules. And that's it.